In the quiet suburbs of Wisconsin, two 12-year-old girls lured their friend into the woods and stabbed her 19 times. They said it was for Slenderman, a faceless figure born on the internet, who somehow became real enough to kill for. It began, as many modern legends do, in the half-lit corners of the internet. A space where imagination runs unchecked, where anonymity breeds creativity, and where sometimes the line between fiction and reality grows perilously thin. In June of 2009, on a message board known for its strange humor and endless Photoshop contests, a user calling himself Victor Surge uploaded a pair of eerie black and white images. They looked ordinary at first glance. Groups of children at play, frozen in time by a photographer's lens. But lurking in the background was something else. Something impossibly tall, impossibly thin, faceless, and dressed in a dark suit. This figure was given a name almost immediately: the Slenderman. The images were a joke, a clever entry into a contest meant to craft new supernatural hoaxes. But something about those pictures resonated in a way few online creations ever do. They were unsettling not just for what they showed, but for what they suggested. The faceless man in the shadows, reaching toward children, seemed to echo stories older than the internet itself. Whispers of bogeymen, tales of child snatchers, figures that lived in forests and crept at the edges of civilization. The Slenderman, though born of Photoshop, felt ancient, as if he had been with us all along. The legend spread at lightning speed. Forum users began to write short stories, mock police reports, and diary entries about encounters with this new monster. YouTube channels created found footage horror inspired by him, most famously the series Marble Hornets, which drew millions of viewers into its unsettling narrative of paranoia and stalking. And soon, the Slenderman was everywhere. In creepypastas, in fan art, in online games, in whispered conversations between children who swore they had seen him in the woods near their homes. What began as fiction was becoming something far stranger. People started reporting sightings. They swore they woke in the night to see a tall shadow in the corner of their room. Children claimed the faceless man had visited their dreams. The Slender Man had escaped his creators and seeped into collective imagination. And then, in 2014, the story took a horrifying turn. In Waukesha, Wisconsin, two 12-year-old girls, Anissa and Morgan Geyser, lured their friend Payton into the woods. What happened next shocked not just the quiet suburb, but the entire world. The girls stabbed Payton 19 times, leaving her bleeding and barely alive, all in an attempt, they said, to prove their loyalty to Slenderman. The attack transformed what had once been a digital ghost story into a very real nightmare. Suddenly, parents, teachers, and psychologists were forced to ask impossible questions. How could an internet legend inspire children to commit such violence? Did they truly believe Slenderman was real, or had they simply found in him an excuse, a dark mythology to justify something already broken within them? The Waukesha stabbing was not the end of Slenderman's influence. In the years that followed, more stories surfaced, of children drawing his likeness in school notebooks, of teens whispering about him in hushed tones, of adults shaken by nightmares they couldn't explain. Slenderman had become more than a meme. He was a cultural phenomenon, a living myth, and in some ways, a mirror reflecting the fears of a digital generation. This is the story of how a creature born from pixels and imagination bled into the real world. A story of the internet's power to create, to spread, and sometimes to destroy. It is the story of belief, how myths take root, how they evolve, and how, in one tragic case, they inspired a crime that still haunts a community. And it is also a story of us. Because Slenderman is not just about a faceless figure in the woods. He is about the shadows of our own minds, about the fears we whisper to each other in the dark, and about the way stories, once set loose, can take on a life of their own. The legend of Slenderman begins in a corner of the internet, but it does not end there. In the summer of 2009, the internet was already a strange and fertile ground for modern folklore. It was the age of forums, when communities on sites like Something Awful, 4chan, and Creepypasta were trading ghost stories, bizarre images, and tales designed to unsettle. But few contributions would ripple outward with the force of what Eric Knudsen, under the pseudonym Victor Surge, created. Knudsen's photos weren't just clever. They tapped into something primal. In the first doctored image, children are playing in the sun, but in the background looms the figure, faceless, towering, with unnaturally long arms. In another, we see frightened children gathered around the same dark silhouette, his spidery limbs stretching into the air like antennae. Beneath the photos, Knudsen added cryptic captions, snippets of fake evidence that hinted at missing children, unexplained fires, and vanished witnesses. The response was immediate. Forum users were captivated. They began layering stories on top of Knudsen's creation, spinning entire backstories and folklore out of thin air. Some said Slenderman lived in the woods, luring children to their deaths. Others described him as a watcher, haunting dreams, waiting at the edge of vision. Within days, a collaborative mythos had been born, growing richer with every post. It's important to understand just how unusual this was. Folklore has always been communal. Stories passed from one person to another, changed in the retelling. But the internet accelerated that process 1,000-fold. What might have taken centuries around campfires spread worldwide in a matter of hours. Slenderman wasn't just a story. He was an experiment in digital folklore, a crowdsourced monster, alive in the way myths are alive, through belief and repetition. But there was something more unsettling at play. Slenderman wasn't locked in books or folklore archives. He lived in images, in videos, in the endless scroll of online forums where imagination blurred into reality. And because he was faceless, blank, undefined, people could project onto him whatever they feared most. He was adaptable. He was malleable. And in that sense, he was perfect. Soon, YouTube carried the myth even further. A series called Marble Hornets appeared, shot in shaky, found-footage style. It told the story of a filmmaker haunted by a mysterious figure known as the Operator. Tall, faceless, dressed in black. It didn't call him Slenderman, but the resemblance was unmistakable. The series was eerie, understated, and addictive. Viewers binge-watched episodes late into the night, convinced they saw shapes in the static, figures in the trees. By the time it ended, Marble Hornets had racked up millions of views and cemented Slenderman's place as the internet's first true monster. But here is where the story takes its first disturbing turn. What started as entertainment, as fiction, as fun, began leaking into real life. Children and teenagers whispered about Slenderman not just as a story, but as something they feared. Some claimed to see him outside their windows. Others insisted he stalked them in dreams. Sleep paralysis victims described waking in the night to find a faceless man watching them from the corner of the room. Was it imagination? Was it suggestion? Or had something more troubling happened? Had the collective focus of millions actually brought the monster into existence? Psychologists have a word for this, the tulpa. In Tibetan mysticism, it refers to a thought form, an entity conjured into being through sheer belief and concentration. The idea is that if enough minds dwell on something, they can will it into existence. Not in the physical sense, perhaps, but in ways that feel real enough to terrify. By the end of 2009, barely months after Eric Knudsen uploaded his eerie images, people were no longer just reading about Slenderman. They were seeing him, or at least they believed they were. It's easy to dismiss this as mass hysteria or as the power of suggestion. But folklore has always thrived on that fertile space between reality and imagination. Ghost stories become real when we believe them enough to see shadows in the dark. Monsters take form when children whisper their names and shiver under blankets. Slenderman was no different, except his spread was faster, wider, and more potent than any urban legend before him. And as his legend grew, so did the danger. Because belief has consequences. And by 2014, belief in Slenderman would drive 2 children to commit an act of violence so shocking it forced the world to confront a terrifying possibility. What if the internet could not only create myths, but also command behavior? The seed had been planted. The question was no longer whether Slenderman was real. The question was whether people believed in him enough to make him dangerous. By the early 2010s, the internet was no longer just a place for information. It had become a breeding ground for entire ecosystems of imagination. Communities sprouted where strangers, often teenagers, gathered in anonymity to share fears, create stories, and blur the line between reality and fiction. In this atmosphere, Slenderman was not just surviving, he was evolving. The faceless figure began appearing in artwork, in short stories, in sprawling fan fiction. His presence seeped into role-playing games, where users acted out scenarios of being stalked by him or, disturbingly, serving him. Slenderman wasn't just a monster anymore. To some, he was a dark patron, a master figure around which they built rituals of belief. This was where things turned dangerous. For children and teenagers struggling with isolation, anxiety, or a desperate need for belonging, Slenderman became more than a story. He was an anchor, a terrifying one, yes, but also a constant. He was something to believe in when the rest of the world felt chaotic and uncertain. Psychologists would later describe this as a kind of parasocial relationship, the same kind people develop with celebrities or fictional characters. The difference here was that Slenderman demanded nothing and promised everything. His myth suggested he could protect those who served him, that he offered belonging, that he had power in a world where powerless kids felt small and unseen. And so, online spaces became echo chambers where belief fed belief. A teenager in England claimed to see Slenderman outside her window, and another in Canada swore the same thing the next week. Drawings circulated in school notebooks, crude sketches of tall figures with no faces and spidery limbs, reaching into the margins of math problems and history notes. What was happening wasn't entirely new. Throughout history, myths and monsters have emerged from the collective imagination. In Germany, centuries earlier, stories had been told of Der Grossmann, the tall man, a shadowy figure said to haunt forests and snatch disobedient children. In Scandinavian folklore, dark, faceless beings were said to lurk in the woods, waiting to punish the curious. Slenderman fit perfectly into that lineage, like an echo of older fears dressed in a modern suit and tie. But in the age of the internet, the speed of transmission was unprecedented. Legends that once spread slowly through oral tradition now leapt instantly across borders. A child in Wisconsin could read the same story as a teenager in Tokyo on the same night, both adding their own interpretations, both convincing themselves the creature might be watching from the shadows outside their windows. And belief has weight. The more people feared Slenderman, the more real he seemed. Not in the sense of flesh and blood, but in the only sense that matters in folklore, in influence, in consequence, in the choices people make when they believe. By 2012, paranormal radio shows were fielding calls from listeners claiming encounters. People described waking in the night, paralyzed, seeing the tall, faceless figure looming at the foot of their bed. Others swore he appeared in dreams, whispering commands. These stories spread further, reinforcing the idea that Slenderman wasn't just fiction anymore. He was out there. And here lies the unsettling truth. Once a myth convinces enough people, its power no longer depends on whether it's real. This power comes from belief itself. This is the soil in which tragedy grows. Children who feel powerless, lost, or desperate are more vulnerable to influence. They search for meaning, for belonging, for proof that their fears are shared by others. In Slenderman, they found all of that. He was terrifying, yes, but also magnetic. He gave them a story to step into, a role to play. And in May of 2014, in a quiet Milwaukee suburb, two girls would take that role to its most extreme and horrifying conclusion. But before that day arrived, the world needed to understand just how far the legend had spread. How a figure born from a Photoshop contest became a specter that stalked not just the imaginations of children, but their waking lives. Slenderman was no longer just an urban legend. He had become, in a very real sense, a cultural parasite, feeding on belief, growing stronger with every retelling, and waiting for someone somewhere to take the story too far. By the early 2010s, Slenderman had become more than just a story whispered in digital corridors. He was everywhere. Teachers began noticing crude sketches of the faceless figure in the margins of students' notebooks. Parents overheard children daring each other to summon him, like a digital-age version of Bloody Mary. And across YouTube, countless homemade horror videos were uploaded, all bearing the same chilling motif: a tall, faceless figure lurking at the edge of vision. For many, this was harmless fun, the thrill of playing with fear, of participating in a communal ghost story. But for others, the line between fiction and reality was beginning to blur in dangerous ways. In countless forums, children and teenagers wrote about Slenderman as though he were real. Some begged him for protection. Others pledged loyalty, describing themselves as his proxies, servants who carried out his will. The mythology was expanding not by design, but by sheer collective creativity. And the darker the stories grew, the more they fed into a cycle of obsession. This was the backdrop against which two 12-year-old girls in Waukesha, Wisconsin, Anissa and Morgan Geyser, discovered Slenderman. Like so many of their peers, they stumbled across the stories online. But unlike most, they didn't treat him as fiction. To them, Slenderman was terrifyingly real. Morgan had always been imaginative, prone to retreating into fantasy worlds. Anissa was quieter, more socially withdrawn, and often felt like an outsider. Together, they formed a friendship rooted in shared secrets, whispered stories, and a fascination with the darker corners of the internet. Slenderman became a fixation. They read about him late at night, watched videos, and convinced each other that he wasn't just a story, he was out there. And in their minds, he wasn't just watching. He was demanding. The mythology they consumed online suggested that Slenderman lived in a grand mansion hidden deep within Wisconsin's forests. It was a place where his followers, his proxies, could live under his protection. But entry into that mansion, they believed, came at a cost, a sacrifice, proof of loyalty. For most children, this would have remained a spooky game, nothing more. But for Morgan and Anissa, the line between fantasy and obligation blurred. They began to believe that if they didn't act, Slenderman would harm them and their families. In their minds, the only way to survive was to appease him. That belief crystallized into a horrifying plan. On May 31, 2014, the two girls invited their friend, Payton, known affectionately as Bella, to a sleepover. To anyone else, it looked like an ordinary weekend gathering of preteens. They ate pizza, played games, and stayed up late whispering in the dark. But beneath the surface, Anissa and Morgan were plotting something unthinkable. They had decided that Bella would be their sacrifice. The next morning, the three girls set out for the park. The sun was bright, the air warm with the promise of summer. To neighbors and passers-by, nothing seemed amiss. But inside the minds of Anissa and Morgan, the story they had spun was reaching its climax. They lured Bella into the woods. What happened next would horrify the world. An act of violence so brutal, so incomprehensible, that it forced parents, psychologists, and law enforcement to reckon with an entirely new kind of danger: the power of internet-born myth. But to understand what happened in those woods, we must first understand what was happening in the minds of those two girls. Because what unfolded that day was not just the story of a stabbing. It was the story of belief so strong, so warped, that it transformed a digital ghost into a reason to kill. And once it happened, there would be no going back. The morning of May 31, 2014, began like so many others in Waukesha, Wisconsin. The suburban neighborhood was quiet, the streets lined with trees just starting to fill out with summer green. Children played in yards, families prepared for the weekend, and in one small apartment, three girls gathered for what seemed like an ordinary sleepover. Payton Bella Lutner was 12 years old. Bright, kind-hearted, and trusting, she considered Morgan Geyser one of her closest friends. She didn't know that for weeks, Morgan and another classmate, Anissa, had been secretly planning something terrible. To Bella, this was just another day of friendship, a morning of fun before summer break began in earnest. The girls decided to walk to David's Park, a patch of green in Waukesha with a wooded area at its edge. They carried granola bars and silly chatter, the kind of casual energy only 12-year-olds carry. But underneath, two of them were waiting for the right moment. In their minds, this wasn't play. It was ritual. They believed that if they did not carry out the act, Slenderman would come for them. They believed he would hurt their families. And in the twisted narrative they had built together, The only way to earn his protection was through blood. At first, they tried in the park bathroom. Morgan held Bella by the arm, but the setting didn't feel right. Too exposed. Too easy to be interrupted. They hesitated. Then, as if guided by some grim instinct, they coaxed Bella deeper into the trees. The woods were quiet, the sound of cars on the nearby road muffled by leaves. To Bella, there was no reason to be afraid. These were her friends. And then, everything changed. Morgan produced a kitchen knife, a long blade she had taken from her home and hidden in her bag. The plan was no longer whispers and drawings on notebook paper. It was real. The first stab came fast, shocking Bella before she could even process what was happening. Then another, and another. 19 times the blade struck. Into her arms, her legs, her torso. One wound missed her heart by less than a millimeter. Another sliced through her diaphragm. The attack was frenzied, chaotic, fueled not by rage but by conviction. The chilling certainty of two children who believed they were doing what they had to do. Bella fell to the forest floor, bleeding, struggling for breath. In the minds of Anissa and Morgan, this was the moment that sealed their fate. They told Bella to lie still, to stay quiet, and then, in a chilling echo of the myths they believed, they left her there, alone. But Bella did not die. Summoning a strength that defied her injuries, she pulled herself to her knees. Her body was weak, but her will was stronger. Step by step, she crawled through the brush, leaving a trail of blood behind her. Somehow, she found the strength to rise and stumble toward the road. And there, by sheer chance, she was found. A cyclist passing by spotted her collapsed near the curb. He saw the blood, the vacant stare, the desperate plea in her eyes. He called 911. Within minutes, paramedics arrived, racing to stabilize the 12-year-old girl whose body had been torn apart, but whose spirit refused to surrender. As Bella was rushed to the hospital, police fanned out into the neighborhood. Somewhere nearby, 2 other 12-year-olds were wandering, convinced they had secured their place as servants of Slenderman. What they didn't realize was that the world they had built in their heads was about to collapse, and the entire nation was about to learn their names. The emergency call came in just before noon. A cyclist had found a young girl staggering from the woods, her clothes soaked in blood. The dispatcher's voice was calm, but urgent, relaying the details to paramedics already en route. By the time first responders reached her, Payton Lutner was barely conscious. Her breathing was shallow, her pulse faint, yet she was alive. In the chaos of the scene, one detail stood out. She was only 12 years old. Paramedics worked quickly, sealing wounds, lifting her onto a stretcher, and rushing her to the nearest trauma center. Doctors would later say that if even one of the stab wounds had been a fraction of an inch deeper, she would not have survived. The fact that she had managed to crawl out of the forest at all was nothing short of a miracle. As Payton fought for her life in surgery, police began piecing together what had happened. Witnesses reported seeing her that morning with 2 other girls, classmates from the same middle school. Their names were Morgan Geyser and Anissa Wire. Now they were missing. The search began immediately. Officers combed the park and the surrounding woods, their radios crackling with updates. Patrol cars cruised the quiet suburban streets. Flyers with the girls' descriptions went out across the county. It didn't take long. Hours later, a patrol officer spotted 2 figures walking along a highway, still in the same clothes from the morning. They looked small, almost fragile, their backpacks slung over narrow shoulders. But inside one of those bags was the weapon, a bloodied kitchen knife with a 5-inch blade. The girls were calm when the officer approached. Too calm. They didn't resist. They didn't run. When asked where they were going, their answer was simple and chilling. "We're going to live with Slenderman." At the police station, investigators tried to make sense of what they were hearing. The girls spoke matter-of-factly, as though their actions were not only justified, but necessary. Morgan explained that Slenderman had demanded a sacrifice. Anissa added that they believed his mansion was hidden in the Nicolet National Forest, some 200 miles to the north. If they killed their friend, they said, Slenderman would welcome them as his servants. The detectives were stunned. These were not hardened criminals, not even teenagers. They were sixth graders, children. And yet the words coming out of their mouths were the language of obsession, of delusion, of myth turned into motivation. When asked why Payton, why Bella, Morgan's answer was chilling in its simplicity. Someone had to be the sacrifice. The interviews painted a picture of two children who had fallen deep into a shared fantasy. Anissa told police she first learned about Slenderman online and introduced Morgan to the stories. Together, they became convinced he was real. They whispered about him at school, traded links to creepypasta stories, and fueled each other's fears. The more they read, the more certain they became that their lives depended on proving their loyalty. And so they planned. Not for days, but for months. The stabbing, investigators learned, had been discussed since February. Meticulously plotted by two girls who could barely tie their own shoes a few years earlier. Back at the hospital, Payton miraculously survived. Doctors worked through the night, repairing organs, sealing arteries, fighting to stabilize the damage inflicted by 19 stab wounds. When she woke, she asked the first question any 12-year-old would. Did they catch them? Yes, they had. But for the community of Waukesha, and soon for the world, the question was no longer just about catching two girls. It was about something far more unsettling. How could children so young believe so deeply in something so unreal that they would try to kill for it? The answer would not come easily. And as the story spread across headlines, one thing became certain. Slenderman had crossed a line that few urban legends ever reach. He had not only lived in the imagination, he had stepped into reality with blood on his hands. News travels fast in small towns. By the evening of May 31st, 2014, word had already spread across Waukesha. A girl had been stabbed in the woods. At first, neighbors whispered in disbelief. A stabbing? Here? In a quiet Milwaukee suburb where crime rarely went beyond petty theft or teenage mischief. But the whispers turned into gasps when the details emerged. The attackers weren't shadowy strangers. They weren't older teens from some distant neighborhood. They were 12-year-old girls. And their reason, if it could even be called that, was more bizarre than anything the community had ever heard. They had done it for Slenderman. Within hours, the story leapt from local news to national headlines. Newspapers splashed it across their front pages. Preteen stab friend, claim motive was internet horror character. Television anchors spoke with tones of shock, their voices faltering over the surreal details. By the following morning, cable networks were running constant coverage. CNN, NBC, Fox. All of them carried the same haunting images. Two middle school mugshots, the pale faces of Morgan Geyser and Anissa Wire staring blankly into the camera. To the public, the details sounded like something out of a nightmare. Two children luring their friend into the woods. 19 stab wounds. A plan to walk hundreds of miles to find a mansion in the forest where a faceless internet monster supposedly lived. It was the kind of story that seemed too strange, too grotesque to be real. And yet it was. Parents across America reacted with fear and outrage. They asked themselves questions that had no easy answers. How could children confuse fiction with reality so completely? How could the internet, a tool meant for learning and play, lead to such horror? And most of all, how could anyone have predicted this? For the people of Waukesha, the sense of betrayal was overwhelming. These weren't faceless headlines. These were neighbors, classmates, friends. Teachers remembered Morgan as imaginative, though sometimes unsettling. Anissa was quiet, shy, often struggling to fit in, and Payton, the victim, was described by everyone as gentle, loyal, the kind of child who would follow her friends into the woods without hesitation. Now, one of them was fighting for her life in a hospital bed. Two others were facing charges in a courtroom, and the community was left grappling with a question it could not escape. Had the internet created a monster, or had it merely revealed something already lurking in the minds of children? Psychologists began weighing in. Some warned that children with vivid imaginations and fragile identities could become dangerously immersed in online mythology. Others argued this was less about the internet and more about untreated mental illness. Still others suggested it was a tragic collision of both, a digital myth colliding with impressionable minds that were searching for meaning. Meanwhile, the name Slenderman was suddenly everywhere. Search engines spiked with millions of queries. News outlets ran explainers about his origins. The Something Awful forum, the doctored photos, the creepypasta stories. Parents who had never heard of him before now saw his faceless silhouette on their screens, accompanied by phrases like stabbing, sacrifice, and delusion. And with every headline, the myth itself grew stronger. Slenderman, once confined to forums and fan fiction, had entered the mainstream. He was now the subject of nightly debates, parental warnings, and late-night talk show jokes. But behind the media spectacle lay something far darker. The undeniable proof that stories, once unleashed, can shape reality in ways no one can fully control. In the days after the attack, as Payton began her slow recovery, the town of Waukesha was left in shock. Candlelight vigils were held. Families gathered in churches and community centers, clinging to each other for reassurance. And in every conversation, one name echoed again and again: Slenderman. But Slenderman wasn't on trial. 2 12-year-old girls were. And as the legal process began, the world would soon confront another chilling question. How should a society judge children who commit an adult crime, especially when they claim they did it under the influence of a myth? The courtroom in Waukesha County was hushed as the 2 girls were led in, their wrists bound in handcuffs far too large for their small frames. Morgan Geyser and Anissa were only 12 years old, yet the gravity of the crime they had committed placed them in a setting that felt far beyond their years. The wooden benches creaked as parents, reporters, and local residents filled every seat, straining to glimpse the children whose names had already become infamous. The charge was attempted first-degree intentional homicide, the most serious crime on Wisconsin's books. And almost immediately, a second shock followed. Prosecutors announced that, under state law, because of the severity of the offense, the girls would be charged as adults. The words rippled through the courtroom like a cold wave. Adult charges. For children who were still in middle school, who still clutched stuffed animals at night, who were barely old enough to babysit. Yet here they were, facing the possibility of decades behind bars. It was a decision that split the public. Some saw it as necessary. 19 stab wounds, premeditated planning, a motive, however fantastical, rooted in violence. To them, the crime demanded accountability regardless of age. Others recoiled. How could society place 2 12-year-olds in the same category as hardened criminals? How could it hold children responsible for a crime committed under the grip of delusion? As the debate raged, Morgan and Anissa sat silently, their small bodies dwarfed by the weight of the courtroom. They showed no signs of defiance, no dramatic outbursts. Instead, they seemed almost detached, as though the enormity of the proceedings could not fully penetrate their understanding. Behind closed doors, investigators continued to unravel their stories. Morgan, in particular, spoke of Slenderman with an eerie calm. She described him not as a fantasy, but as a real being who watched from the shadows, who threatened to harm her family if she disobeyed. Anissa echoed the belief, saying she had been terrified of what would happen if they failed to act. To them, this wasn't just a story. It was survival. Psychologists who evaluated the girls found themselves navigating uncharted territory. Was this a case of shared delusion, folie à deux, where 2 individuals reinforce each other's distorted beliefs until reality itself becomes warped? Or was it something else entirely, a dangerous fusion of imagination, loneliness, and the overwhelming influence of the internet? The more experts listened, the clearer one thing became. These girls were not motivated by malice in the traditional sense. They weren't thrill-seekers. They weren't budding psychopaths hungry for violence. They were children who had lost their grip on what was real and what was not, and in that blur had committed an act of near-fatal brutality. Meanwhile, Payton, the girl they had left bleeding in the woods, continued to recover. Doctors marveled at her resilience. Though her body bore the scars of 19 stab wounds, her spirit remained unbroken. She became the silent presence in the courtroom, not physically there at every hearing, but felt in every word spoken. Every time the charges were read, every time the defense argued for mercy, the image of Payton fighting for her life hung in the air like a shadow. As the months passed, the case drew global attention. News crews camped outside the courthouse. Documentaries were announced. Parents across the country suddenly found themselves asking their children if they knew who Slenderman was. The internet's most infamous monster had been dragged into the harsh light of the justice system, and now the question was no longer just about folklore. It was about responsibility. Should children be punished like adults when their crime is born from fantasy? Or should society recognize that the very world adults had built, a digital world filled with endless myths and shadows, had played a role in shaping their delusion? The law, however, is not built for ambiguity. And as the hearings continued, it became clear that the court would have to make a decision that could change two young lives forever. The community of Waukesha wanted justice. But justice, in this case, was anything but simple. The more investigators spoke with Morgan Geyser and Anissa Wire, the more unsettling their testimonies became. They didn't talk like killers. They didn't even talk like children who understood the magnitude of what they had done. Instead, they spoke with the conviction of believers, as though they had been carrying out instructions from an unseen master. Morgan, in particular, seemed consumed by the mythology. In interviews, she described Slenderman as though he were tangible, a figure who lingered just out of sight, who threatened her family if she failed to obey. Her tone was calm, almost detached, as if she were reciting facts. It didn't take long before questions of her mental state came to the forefront. Court-appointed psychiatrists and psychologists conducted evaluations, peeling back the layers of her thinking. What they found was deeply troubling. Morgan was diagnosed with early-onset schizophrenia, a rare and devastating condition, especially in someone so young. She reported hallucinations, voices whispering to her, figures appearing in her room. She said she could communicate telepathically with fictional characters, that she had seen Slenderman, not just online, but in her dreams, in her waking hours, in the corners of her reality. The diagnosis reframed everything. Morgan wasn't simply a child who believed a story too deeply. She was a child whose perception of the world had fractured, whose grip on reality had loosened under the weight of psychosis. For her, Slenderman wasn't an internet meme. He was real, he was terrifying, and he was inescapable. Anissa's case was different. She did not suffer from schizophrenia, but her personality and vulnerabilities made her highly susceptible to influence. Psychologists described her as socially isolated, struggling with anxiety, desperate for belonging. When she and Morgan became friends, Slenderman became their shared obsession. Anissa reinforced Morgan's delusions, and Morgan gave Anissa's fears a narrative to cling to. Together, they spiraled into a feedback loop of belief. The psychiatric reports painted a picture not of cold-blooded killers, but of children swept into a maelstrom of mental illness and myth. Still, the legal system had to wrestle with a difficult truth. Intent mattered, and intent was clear. They had planned the attack for months. They had brought a weapon. They had lured Payton into the woods with purpose. The prosecutors argued that regardless of delusion, a crime had been committed. The defense countered that the girls were not operating in reality, at least not in the same reality as everyone else. How could they be judged by adult standards when their very perception of the world was warped beyond recognition? Meanwhile, the public reaction grew more polarized. Some saw Morgan's diagnosis as proof that she needed treatment, not prison. Others viewed it as an excuse, a way to sidestep accountability. Talk radio shows buzzed with debates. Online forums exploded with arguments about parenting, mental illness, and the dangers of letting children wander too deeply into the internet's shadows. For Payton's family, the conversations felt almost surreal. Their daughter had barely survived 19 stab wounds. The scars across her body were permanent reminders of what she had endured. And yet, in court, the focus shifted again and again to the state of mind of her attackers. The legal system was built on parsing intent, but for Payton's parents, the reality was much simpler. Their daughter had been left to die in the woods by two girls she trusted. As the months turned into years, hearings dragged on. Expert after expert testified about delusions, psychosis, shared fantasy, and the vulnerabilities of adolescence. Slowly, the path toward trial became less about whether Morgan and Anissa were guilty, and more about what should be done with them. Prison or treatment? Justice demanded one answer. Compassion demanded another. And in that gap, the case of the Slenderman stabbing became something larger than Waukesha. It became a national reckoning over how to deal with children who commit adult crimes, and how the internet's myths could intertwine with fragile minds in ways no one had fully prepared for. The case of Morgan Geyser and Anissa Wire dragged on for years. What had begun with the flashing lights of police cars in a suburban park stretched into a marathon of hearings, evaluations, and motions. Every step was scrutinized, not only by the people of Waukesha, but by a public still fixated on the crime that had dragged an internet legend into reality. From the beginning, both the prosecution and the defense knew this was no ordinary trial. The girls were children, but the crime was not. The law was rigid, but their mental states were anything but simple. For Anissa, the argument centered on her vulnerability to influence. She wasn't hallucinating. She didn't see Slenderman in her bedroom or hear him whisper in her mind. But she believed in him all the same. She was impressionable, socially isolated, and deeply susceptible to Morgan's conviction. Psychologists described her as a follower, not the mastermind, but the one who clung to belief because it gave her a sense of purpose. For Morgan, the issue was far starker. Her diagnosis of schizophrenia was undeniable. She experienced hallucinations. She lived in delusion. For her, Slenderman was not an internet story but a presence as real as any person in the courtroom. Doctors testified that she needed treatment, not prison. The courtroom battles were long, complex, and often agonizing. Prosecutors emphasized the brutality of the attack. 19 stab wounds, a victim left to die. They showed drawings the girls had made, evidence of their planning, the knife hidden in Morgan's bag. They argued that delusion did not erase intent. The defense countered with psychiatric testimony. They painted a portrait of two children swept into an alternate reality, unable to distinguish fact from fiction. They asked the jury and the judge to consider not just the act, but the state of mind behind it. Years passed, hearings delayed, trials postponed. Each time the case returned to the news, Slenderman's faceless image reappeared in headlines, a reminder that myths can cast long shadows. Finally, in 2017, a resolution began to take shape. Both girls entered plea agreements that acknowledged the crime but shifted the focus toward mental health treatment rather than traditional punishment. Anissa Wire pleaded guilty to attempted second-degree homicide. A jury then deliberated on her mental state, ultimately agreeing that she had been suffering from a mental illness at the time of the crime. In September 2017, she was sentenced to 25 years in a mental health institution. Morgan Geyser's case followed soon after. She pleaded guilty to attempted first-degree homicide, but like Anissa, her case hinged on mental illness. The court found her not guilty by reason of mental disease. In February 2018, she was sentenced to 40 years in a psychiatric hospital. For both girls, the decisions were monumental. They would not spend their lives in prison, but their freedom was not guaranteed. Release would depend on treatment, progress, and ongoing evaluations by mental health professionals. In many ways, their futures became indefinite, suspended between recovery and confinement. For Payton, the outcomes were both a relief and a wound. She had survived. She was alive, attending school, rebuilding her life with the support of family and friends. But she carried scars, both physical and emotional, that no sentence could erase. In later interviews, Payton would describe her recovery as a second chance, but also as a burden. She had to live with what her friends had done to her, and she had to reconcile her own trust with the betrayal that nearly killed her. For Waukesha, the verdicts brought closure but not peace. Candlelight vigils gave way to ongoing conversations about mental health, internet culture, and childhood vulnerability. Parents asked themselves whether their children could fall into the same trap. Schools reconsidered how they monitored what students were reading and writing online. And across the nation, the case became a reference point in debates about the dangers of digital folklore. The justice system had rendered its judgment. But in truth, there were no winners. One girl nearly lost her life. 2 others lost their childhoods. And a community lost its sense of innocence. The story of Slenderman had begun as fiction, but in Waukesha, it ended with very real consequences. Scars, institutions, and a reminder that myths, once unleashed, can have lives of their own. Even after the verdicts were read, the story did not fade. If anything, the Slenderman stabbing seemed to grow larger in the cultural imagination. The details were too strange, too disturbing, to simply file away as another crime in another suburb. It was a case that forced society to confront a new kind of fear, the realization that the internet, for all its wonders, could also give birth to nightmares that children believed in deeply enough to kill for. News outlets continued to dissect every angle. Nightly talk shows debated the role of online communities in shaping young minds. Was the internet itself to blame, or was it simply the newest stage for age-old human fears? Columnists wrote about digital folklore, noting how quickly the Slenderman myth had spread compared to older legends passed down through generations. Documentaries soon followed. HBO released Beware the Slenderman in 2016, an intimate look at the Waukesha case. It interwove interviews with the families of Morgan and Anissa, expert commentary on internet culture, and haunting animations of the Slenderman mythos itself. Viewers watched as parents struggled to understand how their daughters could fall so far into fantasy, as psychiatrists explained the vulnerabilities of adolescence, and as the faceless figure loomed across the screen, not as a monster of flesh and blood, but as an embodiment of fear and obsession. The documentary struck a nerve. It raised questions about parental oversight in the digital age. How do you protect children from a story that can be found with a single search? How do you filter myth from reality when the internet thrives on blurring that line? And how do you recognize when fascination tips into delusion? Meanwhile, the name Slenderman had entered mainstream culture in ways no one could have predicted. Video games inspired by him spread across platforms. Independent horror films leaned on his imagery. He appeared in late-night comedy sketches, Halloween costumes, even in casual conversation as shorthand for anything eerie and inexplicable. For many, he was just a character, a meme, a spooky internet invention. But for Waukesha, he would forever be tied to 19 stab wounds and a trail of blood through the woods. The case also fueled moral panic. Some schools banned discussions of Slenderman altogether. Parents monitored their children's online activity with new vigilance. Teachers were trained to recognize early signs of obsession with dark internet folklore. In some places, the fear spread so far that even unrelated drawings of faceless figures sparked alarm. But beneath the fear was a deeper conversation. Experts began to frame Slenderman not simply as a monster, but as a mirror. He reflected the anxieties of a digital generation. Fears of isolation, of being watched, of the unknown lurking just beyond the screen. He was faceless because he was meant to be universal, a canvas for whatever horror each person carried inside. And perhaps most disturbingly, the Waukesha case showed that belief itself can be dangerous. When children are already vulnerable, lonely, anxious, or struggling with mental illness, myths can become more than stories. They can become instructions. For Payton, the cultural frenzy was a double-edged sword. She had survived the attack, but the world around her seemed determined to relive it, to analyze it, to project meaning onto her trauma. She was strong, but she was also a child trying to reclaim a life that had been violently interrupted. Each headline, each documentary, each whispered conversation in her community was a reminder of what she had endured. The case had begun with a story, a faceless man in a suit, born from a Photoshop contest. It had spiraled into obsession, into violence, into hospital beds and courtroom debates. Now it lived on in the culture, not as a ghost in the woods, but as a cautionary tale about the power of the stories we tell, and the fragile line between imagination and reality. And as the Slenderman myth spread further, another question began to surface. Was this truly the first time a story had bled into reality in such a violent way? Or was Slenderman only the most visible symptom of something much older, much deeper, the timeless power of myths to shape human behavior, for better or worse? Long before the internet, long before television or radio, people told stories to explain the unexplainable. Around fires, in villages, in hushed whispers at night, Myths and legends formed the backbone of how humanity processed fear. Monsters lurked in forests. Spirits haunted rivers. Warnings were wrapped in tales meant to keep children close to home and away from danger. Slenderman may feel like a product of the digital age, but in truth, he belongs to a lineage as old as storytelling itself. In Germany, centuries ago, there were whispers of Der Grossmann, the tall man. He was said to haunt the Black Forest, a shadowy figure who preyed on children who strayed too far from their homes. Drawings from the 16th century, crude and haunting, depict a spindly figure looming over families, arms outstretched. Parents invoked his name to keep their children obedient, just as generations of parents across the world have used monsters as tools of discipline. In Scandinavian folklore, there were tales of faceless beings who lived in the woods, waiting to ensnare wanderers. In England, stories of the bogeyman kept children from straying after dark. In nearly every culture, some version of the Dark Watcher exists, tall, silent, terrifying not because of what he does, but because of what he represents. The unknown. Slenderman fits seamlessly into this tradition. His facelessness is not new. It is the ultimate blank canvas, the void onto which we project our deepest fears. His silence, his long limbs, his preference for lurking at the edge of vision. These are archetypes, patterns that have repeated for centuries because they speak to something primal within us. But there is one key difference. Older myths traveled slowly. They were told from mouth to mouth, shaped over years, passed down like family heirlooms. Slenderman, by contrast, spread at lightning speed. Within days of his creation, he was global. Within weeks, he was everywhere. And within years, he had not only been believed, but acted upon in ways that shook the world. The internet did not invent folklore. It accelerated it. What once took generations to build now happens overnight. A single image, a few words of text, can plant seeds in thousands of minds at once. And when those seeds grow, they do so in echo chambers where stories are reinforced, not questioned. In this way, Slenderman is not just an urban legend. He is the first myth of a new era, one born not from fireside whispers, but from forums, memes, and algorithms. And like the myths before him, his power lies not in whether he is real, but in how deeply people believe. The Waukesha case made this painfully clear. Belief was enough to drive two children to violence. Belief was enough to carve wounds into a community. Belief was enough to transform a faceless Photoshop creation into a name recognized around the world. Yet even as Slenderman was debated on news panels and dissected in documentaries, his faceless figure continued to haunt the imagination. Children still drew him. Teenagers still whispered his name. Adults, even skeptics, admitted to feeling a chill when they caught sight of something tall and shadowy in the corner of their eye. Because myths never really die. They only adapt. And Slenderman, with his faceless mask and endless arms, had adapted perfectly to the 21st century. He was a ghost in the machine, a campfire story for the digital age, a reminder that no matter how advanced we become, we are still creatures of fear, still bound to the stories we tell ourselves in the dark. But what happened in Waukesha proved something else as well. Myths can demand a cost. When belief crosses the fragile line between story and reality, consequences follow. And in this case, the cost was almost a young girl's life. The story of Slenderman is not unique because he exists. It is unique because of how quickly we made him real. The Waukesha stabbing was the most infamous, but it was not the only moment when Slenderman's shadow stretched beyond the screen and into real life. Once the story hit global headlines, other incidents began surfacing. Proof that myths, once believed, could inspire imitation. In September 2014, just months after Payton Lutner's near-fatal stabbing, a 14-year-old girl in Port Richey, Florida, set her family's house on fire while her mother and younger brother were still inside. Miraculously, both survived. When questioned, the teenager confessed that she had been reading extensively about Slenderman, along with other dark online material, and felt compelled to act. Investigators found she had been obsessed with internet horror, retreating further into stories that blurred the line between fiction and reality. That same year in Ohio, Police were called when a mother reported her 13-year-old daughter attacking her with a knife. When the girl was questioned, she admitted she had been fascinated with Slenderman, her notebooks filled with references and drawings of the faceless figure. Her fixation had escalated to the point of violence. None of these incidents gained the same level of attention as Waukesha, but they painted a troubling picture. Once a myth becomes powerful enough, it can take root in fragile minds around the world, spawning acts of violence that mimic its darkness. The pattern was not unique to Slenderman. Psychologists have long studied the phenomenon of copycat crimes, where one high-profile act inspires others. In the age of the internet, this effect spreads faster than ever. One story can reach millions overnight, planting ideas that, for most people, remain harmless curiosities, but for a vulnerable few, become blueprints for action. Slenderman had become more than a character. He was a cultural contagion. Parents and educators began speaking of him with the same alarm that previous generations reserved for violent video games, heavy metal music, or satanic panic. Schools banned Slenderman drawings. Some even issued warnings to parents, advising them to monitor what their children consumed online. To many adults, Slenderman wasn't just a story. He was a symptom of a deeper fear, that the internet was raising their children in ways they couldn't see and couldn't control. At the same time, creators within the horror community felt a kind of unease. Slenderman had been born in jest, a collaborative fiction project, a way to explore creativity. But now that creation had spilled blood. Eric Knudsen, the man who first invented Slenderman in 2009, retreated from public comment, shaken by the events in Wisconsin. Other writers who had once enjoyed building stories around the character found themselves asking whether their art had consequences they never intended. And yet, the myth endured. New creepypastas emerged. Independent films used Slenderman as their antagonist. A major Hollywood studio even produced a feature-length movie in 2018, though it was met with backlash for exploiting a story tied to real-world tragedy. Still, the fact that it existed at all was proof that the faceless figure had embedded himself in modern folklore. The Waukesha case had shown what could happen when belief turned deadly. But the copycat incidents proved something even more chilling. Myths don't die when exposed to the light of reality. If anything, they multiply. Every retelling, every headline, every whisper of his name kept Slenderman alive. And with each retelling, the possibility remained that someone, somewhere, might take the story too seriously. The internet had given birth to him, but human imagination and human vulnerability ensured that he would never truly fade. In the years that followed the attack, the shadows of Slenderman never fully left Waukesha. For Payton, the scars on her body were constant reminders of that day in the woods. Doctors marveled that she survived. A knife wound to her chest had missed her heart by mere millimeters. Another had punctured her liver. 19 wounds in all, each carrying the memory of betrayal. Yet survival was not the end of her struggle. Payton had to navigate the invisible wounds. The fear of being alone, the unease of trusting others, the knowledge that 2 girls she once called friends had nearly killed her. Her recovery became a journey not just of physical healing, but of reclaiming her sense of safety in a world that had shown her its darkest side far too soon. For Morgan and Anissa, the aftermath was measured in institutions, psychiatric evaluations, and long stretches of confinement. Their childhoods were essentially over. Morgan, diagnosed with schizophrenia, faced decades of treatment in a state psychiatric hospital. Anissa, sentenced to 25 years in a mental health facility, carried her own burden, knowing she had followed her friend down a path that ended in blood. Their names, forever tied to Slenderman, became cautionary tales whispered in courtrooms, classrooms, and parenting seminars across the country. But the psychological aftermath did not belong only to the girls directly involved. It rippled outward through families, schools, and the entire community of Waukesha. Parents found themselves asking impossible questions. Could my child believe something like this? Could they confuse fiction with reality? For many, the stabbing was a rude awakening. The internet was no longer just a place for games, homework help, and socializing. It was also a place where myths could root themselves deeply enough to alter behavior. Teachers reported seeing more drawings of Slenderman in the months after the attack. Some children talked about him casually, as though testing whether he was real. Others seemed frightened, convinced that the faceless figure might appear in their bedrooms if they stayed up too late. The case had, in effect, legitimized the myth in their imaginations. After all, if two girls had believed enough to stab their friend, didn't that mean there had to be some truth behind the story? For the community, this was perhaps the most unsettling part of all. Myths thrive not because they are true, but because people fear they might be. And in Waukesha, the line between myth and reality had been crossed with a knife. Psychologists began speaking about digital contagion, the way ideas spread online like viruses. Slenderman had become a prime example. He didn't need to exist to cause harm. The belief was enough. Vulnerable children, especially those already struggling with mental health or isolation, could latch onto these myths as explanations for their fears or as structures of meaning in an otherwise confusing world. Parents, meanwhile, were left grappling with guilt and doubt. How could they protect their children from something that wasn't real? How could they monitor every corner of the internet, every forum, every story whispered among peers? For many, the Slenderman case changed the way they thought about parenting in the digital age. It wasn't enough to block websites or filter content. They had to talk to their children, really talk about what they believed, what scared them, and how to tell the difference between fantasy and reality. The case became a kind of modern fable, not just about belief, but about neglect, not parental neglect in the traditional sense, but society's neglect of the digital spaces children now lived in. The internet had become the new playground, but unlike physical playgrounds, it had no fences, no curfews, no watchful eyes. In the aftermath, Waukesha slowly returned to its routines, but it was never the same. The woods where the stabbing occurred became a place people avoided, a site of hushed memory. The names Morgan, Anissa, and Payton became etched into the town's history, inseparable from the faceless figure that had haunted their childhoods. Slenderman was never real, but the fear, the scars, and the trauma he left behind most certainly were. And that was perhaps the cruelest truth of all. The damage myths can do does not depend on their existence, only on their power to be believed. The Slenderman case did not end with the sentencing of Morgan Geyser and Anissa Wire. If anything, it marked the beginning of a larger conversation, one that stretched far beyond Waukesha into living rooms, schools, and even legislative chambers across the country. At its core, the case was not just about two girls and one victim. It was about a society unprepared for the ways the internet could shape the minds of its children. For decades, parents had worried about outside influences, rock music, horror movies, violent video games. But the internet was different. It wasn't a single band or a single film. It was a limitless ocean of content, with myths and stories spreading faster than anyone could contain them. And unlike a scary movie that ends when the credits roll, the internet never stopped. It was always there, glowing in the dark, whispering in forums, feeding imaginations late into the night. Psychologists began to emphasize how vulnerable children and preteens are to this kind of influence. At that age, the brain is still learning to separate fantasy from reality, possibility from impossibility. Combine that with social isolation, mental health struggles, or a desperate need to belong, and the stage is set for dangerous ideas to take root. Morgan's schizophrenia diagnosis highlighted another issue: how early-onset mental illness can go unnoticed or misunderstood until it reaches a crisis point. Her parents had seen signs, drawings, unusual behavior, strange comments, but they had no framework to recognize them as symptoms of a serious disorder. For many families, the case was a wake-up call. Conversations about children's mental health began to shift. Schools hired more counselors. Parents were urged to take their children's fears seriously, even when those fears seemed fantastical. Anissa's case underscored yet another lesson: the power of influence. She wasn't hallucinating. She wasn't delusional, but she was impressionable. In her need for belonging, she followed her friend down a path she might never have walked alone. Experts pointed to this as evidence of how easily children can be swept into groupthink, whether in person or online. At the societal level, lawmakers and educators wrestled with how to respond. Should the internet be more tightly regulated? Should parents be given better tools to monitor what their children see? Or was the solution less about censorship and more about communication? Giving kids the critical thinking skills to navigate the online world safely? Debates flared. Some argued for stricter controls on horror content accessible to minors. Others warned against overreach, pointing out that fearsome stories have always existed, from Grimm's fairy tales to urban legends whispered in playgrounds. The difference, they said, was not the content but the medium. The internet amplified everything. And yet, amidst the panic, another voice emerged. Perhaps the lesson was not to shelter children from every dark story, but to guide them through those stories. To talk with them about what's real, what isn't, and why stories hold power. Myths, after all, had always been part of human life. The problem wasn't the myth itself. It was what happened when myths went unexamined. For Waukesha, these conversations felt both urgent and painfully personal. Parents in the community struggled with guilt. Not only the families directly involved, but neighbors, teachers, and friends. Could someone have seen the warning signs earlier? Could this have been prevented if someone had asked different questions or listened more closely? The truth is complicated. Some tragedies cannot be neatly explained away or easily prevented. But the Slenderman case left behind lessons society could not afford to ignore. That children's inner worlds are powerful and fragile. That the internet, for all its possibilities, can magnify darkness as easily as light. That mental illness in young people must be taken seriously, no matter how unusual the symptoms. And that myths, whether born in forests or forums, hold the ability to shape human behavior in profound ways. Slenderman was not real, but the fear he represented, fear of losing control over what our children believe, fear of violence born from fantasy, fear of a digital world we cannot fully govern, was very real. And in that sense, the case became less about one monster and more about us, our culture, our parenting, our systems, and our collective blind spots. Waukesha had lived through the nightmare. Now the world had to decide what to learn from it. From the moment news of the stabbing broke, the media seized on the story with a kind of frenzy. It had all the elements of a headline built to capture attention. Children, violence, betrayal, and a faceless monster from the internet. Within hours, Slenderman was a household name, splashed across newspapers and shouted from television anchors with a mixture of shock and fascination. But the way the story was told mattered. Some outlets leaned into sensationalism. Headlines declared that the internet made them do it. Graphics of Slenderman appeared on screens, his featureless face looming behind dramatic text. Talk shows speculated endlessly about whether the myth was dangerous, whether parents should fear their children's imaginations, whether something supernatural might be at play. The story was packaged as both true crime and urban legend, blurring the lines in a way that only heightened the myth's reach. Other coverage dug deeper, interviewing psychologists, criminologists, and cyber experts. They emphasized the vulnerabilities of adolescence, the dangers of untreated mental illness, and the speed at which online folklore spreads. These voices tried to shift the focus from the monster to the very real human issues at the heart of the case. Yet, no matter how it was framed, the media amplified Slenderman far beyond what he had been before. A character once confined to creepypasta forums suddenly became a global cultural figure. His name was spoken in living rooms where parents had never once set foot in an internet forum. His image appeared on front pages across the world, each mention fueling the myth even further. Documentaries added another layer. HBO's Beware the Slenderman gave audiences a sobering, intimate look into the minds of Morgan and Anissa. It explored their family's confusion, their obsession with the character, and the way delusion consumed their reality. For some viewers, it was a revelation, a chance to see the humanity behind the headlines. For others, it felt like exploitation, turning tragedy into spectacle. That criticism echoed across other media as well. When Hollywood released its 2018 Slender Man feature film, backlash was swift. Many saw it as tasteless profiteering, capitalizing on a story that had left a real girl fighting for her life. The film was boycotted in some theaters near Waukesha, and Payton's family expressed outrage at the idea of a horror movie being marketed off their trauma. But that, too, revealed something about modern culture. True crime stories are consumed eagerly, dissected, and repackaged across podcasts, documentaries, dramatizations, and headlines. Each retelling risks eroding the human pain at the center of the story, replacing it with spectacle. The Waukesha case became both a cautionary tale about internet myths and a cautionary tale about the way media can turn trauma into entertainment. The coverage also shaped how the public viewed the two perpetrators. Some stories painted Morgan and Anissa as villains, cold-blooded killers who plotted a horrifying act. Others cast them as victims themselves of mental illness, of loneliness, of the internet's darker corners. Public opinion was divided, often reflecting broader debates about justice, childhood, and accountability. For Payton Lutner, the media storm was another battle entirely. While she stayed largely out of the spotlight during her recovery, her name and her story were constantly invoked. Even as she healed, her trauma was replayed on screens, retold in articles, and dissected by strangers. The case belonged to her, but the narrative belonged to everyone else. And that was perhaps the final irony of the media's role. In trying to warn the world about Slenderman, it also gave him more power. Every headline, every retelling, every eerie graphic breathed new life into the faceless figure. What had begun as a Photoshop contest entry in an online forum had now become immortal, not because of his fictional power, but because of the very real power of media repetition. The monster spread not through forests or shadows, but through television screens, newspaper columns, and endless retellings of the story. And the more he was spoken of, the more real he became. When the paramedics wheeled Payton Lutner into the hospital that day in May 2014, the odds of her survival looked slim. 19 stab wounds, a knife thrust that had missed her heart by less than a hair's width, blood loss so severe that every second mattered. But Payton was a fighter, and against all expectation, she pulled through. Her physical recovery was grueling, but straightforward compared to what came next. Learning to live with the weight of what had happened. Every scar was a reminder of betrayal. Every news headline replayed her trauma, and every whisper in the halls of her school. People who now knew her name not as a friend, but as the girl who survived Slenderman, forced her to carry a label she had never asked for. Yet Payton refused to be defined by the attack alone. In the years that followed, she leaned heavily on her family. Her parents became her fiercest protectors, shielding her from the media as best they could while she healed. They worked to keep her life as normal as possible. School, friendships, milestones that every child should have. But of course, nothing about her life would ever be normal again. What set Payton apart was her strength of spirit. In private, she confronted nightmares and flashbacks. In public, she pushed forward, returning to school, pursuing her education, and building new connections. Slowly, she proved to herself and the world that she was not broken. She was surviving. Years later, as Morgan and Anissa faced their sentences, Payton chose to remain largely outside the spotlight. But when she did speak, her words carried weight. In a rare interview with ABC's 2020 in 2019, she told her story on her own terms. Sitting calmly, now a teenager, she spoke about that day in the woods, her recovery, and the lessons she had carried forward. She admitted that trust did not come easily anymore, that she still bore the scars, both visible and invisible. But she also revealed a remarkable sense of clarity. She did not allow herself to hate Morgan or Anissa. She had moved beyond that. For Payton, survival meant reclaiming her future, not being shackled to her past. What stood out most in that interview was her quiet wisdom. She spoke of wanting to live a full life, to graduate, to build a career, to have a family one day. Her survival was not just physical. It was hopeful. She refused to let the attack define her story forever. And in that resilience, she became a symbol. While Slenderman had been painted as a monster of fear, Payton represented the opposite. The ability to endure, to recover, to move forward even after facing unimaginable horror. She was the counterbalance to the myth. For her community, Payton's recovery was a source of pride and relief. People who had lit candles for her in vigils, who had whispered prayers when her survival was uncertain, now saw her walking, smiling, living. She embodied the strength they all hoped could come from tragedy. But Payton's story also carried a sobering truth. Trauma does not vanish. It becomes part of who you are. For her, survival meant carrying scars into adulthood, reminders of a friendship that turned into violence. Yet in carrying those scars, she also carried proof that she had endured something meant to destroy her, and she had risen above it. Slenderman's name may be remembered in connection with terror, but Payton's name will always be remembered in connection with survival. She turned what could have been an ending into a beginning, and in doing so, she reminded the world of something essential. Monsters may haunt us, but they do not have the final word. Survivors do. While Payton worked to rebuild her life, the two girls who had attacked her faced a very different future. Their names were known around the world, forever tied to the word Slenderman. But instead of prison bars, their paths led into psychiatric institutions, where years of treatment, evaluation, and confinement would define their adolescence. Morgan Geyser's diagnosis was clear: schizophrenia, early onset, and severe. Experts testified that she had experienced hallucinations and delusions from a young age, and that her belief in Slenderman was not just fantasy, but part of a broader psychotic illness. She was sentenced in 2017 to a maximum of 40 years in a state psychiatric facility. In practice, that meant indefinite confinement, with release possible only if doctors ever deemed her safe, a prospect uncertain at best. For Morgan, the institution became both punishment and refuge. She received antipsychotic medication, therapy, and structured routines. Her parents visited, grappling with a painful truth. Their daughter's illness had consumed her, and the world would never see her as anything but the girl who stabbed her best friend in the name of a myth. For them, love and grief became inseparable. Anissa Wire's case was different. Unlike Morgan, she was not psychotic. She had not hallucinated Slenderman or heard his voice. Instead, she had been swept into belief by her friend's conviction, her own fears and insecurities amplifying the fantasy until it seemed undeniable. In 2017, she was sentenced to 25 years in a mental health facility, a recognition that she needed treatment, but not necessarily for life. For years, Anissa underwent therapy and evaluations. She expressed remorse repeatedly, acknowledging the horror of what she had done and the weight she would carry forever. Doctors noted her progress, her insight, her ability to distinguish fantasy from reality. Unlike Morgan, her path toward recovery seemed possible. In 2021, after nearly 7 years in custody, Anissa petitioned for her release. The court heard from experts who testified that she was no longer a danger to herself or others, that she had developed coping skills, and that continued confinement might do more harm than good. The judge agreed, ordering her release under strict conditions: GPS monitoring, regular check-ins, therapy, and a lifetime of supervision by the justice system. When she walked out of the Winnebago Mental Health Institute, she was 20 years old, legally free, but bound forever by conditions and by the shadow of what had happened in those woods. She returned to a world where anonymity was impossible, where forgiveness was uncertain, and where every step forward would be watched closely. The contrast between Morgan and Anissa became a study in how society handles young offenders. Was Morgan a criminal or a patient? Was Anissa a manipulator or a follower who lost herself in another's delusion? Could either of them ever truly be forgiven? For some, their sentences were too light, an insult to the trauma Payton endured. For others, they reflected compassion, an understanding that children are not the same as adults, and that mental illness demands treatment, not just punishment. The case forced the justice system to wrestle with questions it was never built to answer. How do you balance accountability with empathy when the perpetrators are children, and when the crime was born from delusion? As the years passed, public attention faded, but not completely. Every court hearing, every decision about release, every small update reignited debate. For Waukesha, those names, Morgan and Anissa, would always linger. They were part of the town's history, part of its cautionary tale. And for the world, their fates underscored a difficult truth: justice is rarely neat. It exists in the gray spaces, where punishment, treatment, forgiveness, and fear collide. Morgan remains confined, her release uncertain. Anissa walks free, but never unburdened. Both carry the weight of a decision made at 12 years old, a decision shaped by myth, fear, and the fragile fault lines of childhood. Years after the stabbing, the echoes of Slenderman still linger, not in the way he was first imagined, lurking in forests or stretching his faceless arms toward children, but in the cultural and societal lessons the case forced us to confront. One legacy lies in the world of internet folklore. Slenderman was not the first creepypasta, but he became the most infamous. His rise, from a single photo edit to a global myth, showed how quickly digital storytelling could create a shared cultural figure. But the Waukesha case changed the tone of that folklore forever. After the stabbing, communities that once played with horror stories began asking themselves harder questions. Where is the line between fun and danger? Can myths be enjoyed responsibly, or do they always risk taking root in someone vulnerable? For many creators, the case was a turning point. They still spun tales of monsters and urban legends, but with a heightened awareness of the possible consequences. Slenderman himself became a cautionary figure, not just within the stories, but in the very act of storytelling. The legacy also shaped parenting in the digital age. Before Waukesha, many parents had only a vague idea of what their children encountered online. The stabbing shattered that complacency. Suddenly, what is my child reading on the internet? Became a pressing question. Schools sent home letters about online safety. Parenting guides emphasized not just filtering content, but talking about it. And for many families, the case became a grim reminder that it's not enough to monitor grades or curfews. It's just as important to understand what fills a child's imagination. Mental health awareness was another piece of the legacy. Morgan's schizophrenia diagnosis highlighted how invisible early-onset mental illness can be, and how little many families know about its warning signs. Her case was used in psychology classrooms, training programs, and conferences as an example of how delusion can take hold in children. Anissa's story, meanwhile, illustrated the power of influence and the fragility of adolescent identity. Together, their paths underscored the need for earlier mental health interventions, greater support for families, and a society more willing to see illness where once it saw only bad behavior. And then there was true crime culture itself. The case became a staple of podcasts, documentaries, and articles, but it also sparked debate. When we retell stories like this, do we honor the victims, or do we exploit their pain? Are we learning from the tragedy, or consuming it as entertainment? These are questions that hover over every true crime narrative, including this one, and the Waukesha case made them impossible to ignore. For Payton, the legacy is personal. Scars, memories, resilience. For Morgan and Anissa, it is a life forever shaped by a decision made at 12 years old. For Waukesha, it is a community marked by an event it never asked for. And for the rest of us, the legacy is a cautionary tale about the power of stories. Because that is what Slenderman ultimately represents. The undeniable truth that stories matter. They shape us, frighten us, inspire us, and sometimes, as this case showed, they can even drive us to violence. The internet did not invent that truth, but it magnified it in ways we are still learning to understand. The faceless man in the woods may not be real, but the fear he represents, fear of losing our children to something we cannot see, fear of myths crossing into reality, fear of what we cannot control, that fear is here to stay. And that is the true legacy of the Slenderman case. Slenderman began as nothing more than a contest entry, a shadowy figure stretched into a photograph, placed there to unsettle, to amuse, to entertain. He was meant to be fiction, a faceless ghost of the digital age. But once the image was released into the wilds of the internet, he slipped free of his creator's hands. From there, he became something larger. Every retelling, every creepypasta, every whispered dare in an online forum gave him more shape, more power. He was not just an invention, he was a reflection, a mirror for the fears that live deep in us all. The fear of the unknown, the faceless stranger, the thing waiting just beyond the treeline. But in Waukesha, Wisconsin, those fears became real. A myth spilled out of imagination and into action, and the result was 19 stab wounds in a patch of quiet suburban woods. A girl nearly lost her life, 2 others lost their childhoods, and a community lost its innocence. As the years passed, the story became more than a crime report. It became a parable about mental illness left unseen, about the vulnerability of children, about the immense influence of the internet, and about the way myths can move through us like contagion. Payton Lutner's survival became a beacon. She proved that even when horror strikes, resilience is possible. She grew. She healed. She refused to let her life be defined by the moment 2 friends turned into would-be killers. Her scars remain, but so does her strength. Morgan Geyser and Anissa Wire became symbols of a different truth. Their paths remind us that children, too, can commit acts of unimaginable violence, but often for reasons more complex than simple malice. Mental illness, isolation, fear, and influence can converge in ways that blur accountability and leave only tragedy in their wake. And for the rest of us, the Slenderman case forced an uncomfortable reckoning. We learned that stories, even the ones we dismiss as harmless, have weight. They shape how we think, what we fear, and sometimes how we act. In this way, Slenderman is not unique. Myths have always held power, but the internet gave this one a speed, a reach, and a longevity that no folktale before it could ever match. So what is the final lesson of Slenderman? Perhaps it is this: we must never underestimate the power of imagination. In the right hands, it creates art, wonder, and connection. In the wrong circumstances, it can twist into delusion, obsession, and violence. Slenderman was never real. He never stood in the woods. He never whispered commands. He never demanded sacrifice. But belief in him was real, and belief is powerful enough to wound, to scar, and to kill. The faceless figure remains in our culture, an eerie reminder that myths do not need to exist in order to have power. What matters is not whether he is real, but whether we believe he could be. And in that space, between reality and imagination, between reason and fear, monsters are born. The story of Slenderman is, in the end, the story of us. Our need to create myths, our vulnerability to them, and our responsibility to face the shadows we conjure, before they slip free and shape the world in ways we cannot control.